Hi everybody, so I wanted to do a video to review the corner to corner crochet stitch, which is the stitch that I use to make my Felix blanket. So if you have never done C2C before and you would like to work this blanket, this tutorial should be hopefully sufficient so that you can start. And even if you have done a lot of C2C projects before, this tutorial still may be helpful because I do require you to make the decreases in a different kind of a way. And if you're having trouble understanding the different way to make the decrease, I'll go over that in this tutorial as well. One thing to notice about my blanket is that C2C stitches sort of look like little squares, and then they create like a grid. So you have, stitches running, lining up vertically, horizontally, and then you can also see how they kind of line up at an angle too on the diagonal. I worked up a little small swatch for you. This one is 4 stitches by 3. When you work C2C stitches, you start with 1 and then you kind of work on the angle. So for a right-handed person, right to left, and you work diagonally up and down your rows. So to start the stitch, you start by chaining 6. And then you'll make 3 double crochets by working 1 stitch in each of the 4th, 5th, and 6th chains from the hook. I always work into the back loops of my chain, and I do that always for every project, not just for this stitch. So if you prefer to use a different chain loop, by all means you can do that for this stitch. And then this unit here that I have is what I am referring to as a stitch in my Felix blanket pattern. And hopefully you can see the 3 double crochets, and then you can see my turning starting chain here. That's what I'm calling the chain 3 loop, and this is where you will build your subsequent C2C stitches. So for row 2, typically in C2C, at least for a little while, with each row you add another stitch. So row 1 was 1 stitch, row 2 will be 2, row 3 will be 3, and so on. And then if you remember, this little rectangle I made was 4 stitches by 3 stitches. So you don't have to keep that pattern forever, but oftentimes when you start, that's how it starts off. So in my pattern, I call this next stitch that I'm about to make an increase. So when you're looking at the pattern and the row starts with increase, this is what I want you to do. I want you to chain 6, and again make 3 double crochets into the 4th, 5th, and 6th chain from the hook. And then I'm not sure if this is what everybody does, but this is what I have always done, so it's what I'm doing here. I always make this first stitch of the new row, this increase stitch, I always make it before I turn my work. But when you do C2C, you always turn your work at the end of every row, just like with anything else. So I made the first stitch of row 2, but I have not turned my work yet. So I'm going to just hold on to this stitch that I made, and then I'm going to turn my work. So now the wrong side of stitch 1 is showing. The other thing you need to do is move it up that way, because you want this chain 3 loop. So here it is down here, it's way over here. You want to get it so that you can slip stitch into it and kind of have like a continuous edge. So the next stitch you make by chaining 3 and then working 3 double crochets. So now I've completed 2 stitches and 2 rows of C2C. And hopefully you can see I have 2 stitches in all of those different directions. And hopefully you can see that the first stitch, row 1, my stitches are oriented horizontally and the wrong side is showing. And then for row 2, the stitches are oriented vertically and the right side is showing. So I'm going to do that one more time. So to make row 3, you want to work into this chain 3 loop here and chain 3 loop here, and we're going to do an increase. And again, I always do the increase before I turn. So I chain 6 and I make a double crochet into the 4th and 5th and 6th chain from the hook. I still need to turn my work, so I'm going to hold on to this first stitch of row 3 and turn everything else and then slip stitch into that space. And then I can chain 3 and make 3 double crochets into that same space that I slip stitched into in order to make my second stitch. And then I can slip stitch into that next chain 3 space, chain 3, and make 3 more double crochets. So now I've worked 3 rows of C2C, and I have a little triangle shape that's 3 stitches high, 3 stitches wide, and 3 stitches along the diagonal. And in my Felix Blanket pattern, there will be a couple of times where I will say to make a starting triangle by working, for example, 6 rows of C2C stitches. So when I say that in the pattern, this is what I want you to do. You would make this shape and then continue making 3 more rows, so that you would just repeat this process for row 4, row 5, and row 6. So at the end, your triangle would be 6 tall, 6 wide, and 6 on the diagonal. So the other thing you can do, and again, you already saw by looking at this little swatch, is you can make what I'm calling decreases. So normally when you start a row, in the Felix Blanket pattern, I'll tell you to start a row with an increase where you chain 6, like we've been doing, or to start a row with a decrease. And when I say to start a row with a decrease, what I want is that if I would have started with an increase, I would have built a stitch right here, and then I would have made 3 more in these chain 3 loops. But when you start with a decrease, I don't want this stitch right here, and instead I want to keep my stitch count and work in these 3 chain 3 loops only. So you will not chain 6, you'll skip that part, and we'll move straight into this loop. But you can't, take your working loop and just get into this space. There's 3 double crochet stitches here in the way. So normally what I always did, and what I think most everybody does, is you turn your work and you work slip stitches into these double crochet stitches, and then eventually make your way into the chain 3 loop. With my Felix Blanket, because of the way the blocks kind of layer on top of each other, you work each block completely. So you will need to make decreases when you make a block, but then later you'll layer a block on top of another block you previously made. And you will need a chain 3 loop. So to solve that problem, I am just requiring or recommending that you always make a chain 3 every time you need to make a decrease. That way you will always have a chain 3 loop to work into later on in the blanket when you need it. So you can imagine that the chain 3 is basically a placeholder for the slip stitches, because you can't just jump into this without doing anything. You need to, to build up the length so that you can reach. I always make chains before I turn my work, but if you prefer, you can turn your work first and then chain 3, but I'm just going to demonstrate it the way I always like to do it. So I chain 3, then I turn my work, and now I can lay this chain 3 across those double crochets so I can reach into that chain 3 loop and make a slip stitch. And then I'll work a stitch by chaining 3 and making 3 double crochets into that same chain 3 loop I slip stitched into. And now hopefully you can see that I started that next 4th row and, I'll turn it back around. So when we ended row 3, we were like this, and I was saying we needed to make our first stitch here, and then that's what we did. So then you can continue, slip stitch into the next space, chain 3, make 3 double crochets, slip stitch into the next space, chain 3, and make 3 double crochets. And then I'll show you another decrease, but I hope that you can kind of understand, especially if you're new to c2c, that if you wanted, depending on the shape you were trying to make, you could start this row with an increase. You could choose to build a stitch here if you wanted to be taller, and if you don't want to be taller, you can choose to put your first stitch here. So if you want your first stitch here, you need to do a decrease, or what I'm calling a decrease in the pattern. And again, for my Felix blanket, you always need to chain 3 for a decrease. So chain 3, I like to turn after I chain, but you can flip those steps if you rather. And then now you can reach into this chain 3 space. And then you can make a stitch by chaining 3 and making 3 double crochets. And then slip stitch and make another stitch. So something else to be aware of for my Felix blanket, because normally when you're making c2c, I think you often are making like a dishcloth or a blanket, something that's usually some kind of a square or rectangle shape. So in my Felix blanket, oftentimes the shapes that we're making need to have a jagged edge. So for example, this stitch here doesn't have anything on top of it. This is where we had decreased on a previous row. Usually, if you're making a square, you don't want to work on top of this. But if you're trying to make a jagged piece, like in this blanket pattern, you might need to work into it. So I just want to show you, it's nothing you know, that you don't know how to do. It's just something that's maybe different, because oftentimes in C2C, you don't make shapes that look like this. You're used to making shapes that have nice straight edges. So when you're making my Felix Blanket pattern, it's really important, two things. One, that you pay attention that if the start of the row says to increase or decrease. If the start of the row says to increase, you will chain 6 and make the 3 double crochets into the chain and then work down. If the start of the row says to decrease, you will chain 3 to get yourself into this chain 3 loop over here and work down. And then you want to count your rows, your stitches in each row, just to make sure you're doing it right, because like I said, I think a lot of times people are used to working with right angles, and there's a lot of this kind of shape that happens in my Felix Blanket. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And then the other thing, if you've been C2C'ing lots, you already know how to do this, but if you're new to it, if you get up here and you do want to keep this straight edge, and this is something you will do in my blanket pattern for the very top, when you square off the top, you do not want to add a stitch up here, but you can't just chain 3 and turn and start working here, because you're going to have a gap that's not going to look very nice in your blanket. So sometimes in the pattern, and like I said, this will happen at the end when you're squaring off the top, I'll say to work, like in this case, 2 stitches, and then I'll say slip stitch into the last. So you worked 1, 2, here's the last one. You could put a stitch here, but I'm saying in the pattern, slip stitch. Now those stitches are stuck together, and now you can do your decrease by chaining 3 and turning and getting into this space, and then working your last stitch by chaining 3 and making 3 double crochets. And then if this was the last stitch of your blanket, you could slip stitch. And then I don't know if this is necessary or what other people do, but I'm kind of really into symmetry, so I would chain 3 and slip stitch there so I end in the corner. But now I made a little shape that's 4 stitches, 3 wide, and then it's on the diagonal. And I reviewed the increase and the decrease. And again, it's just worth saying one more time, when you're working the pattern, you will always turn your work, always. I do not write that in the pattern because I feel that it's understood that you always will turn your work. And if I say to start a row with an increase, you need to, you're going to want to build a stitch on top of wherever you are. So you're going to want to chain 6 and make the 3 double crochets into the 4th, 5th, and 6th chain from the hook. And if I say to start a row with a decrease, you will chain 3 and slip stitch back into the chain 3 loop of the stitch that you're currently on. And then finally, just please make sure you are checking your stitch counts at the end of every row. After you kind of get into the blanket a little bit and you get the initial setup and you make a few blocks, you'll probably find your rhythm, and the pattern will become much more intuitive because it's extremely repetitive. But it's just unfortunate to do a lot of work to get it set up and then to realize that something was off and to have to rip things out and start over. So I highly recommend that you count your stitches for each row until you get a few blocks layered in, and then you can kind of ease up on that if you want to. But I hope that this tutorial helped you. If you've never done C2C stitch before, you do not need to go out and make a huge project. You could just work up a little small swatch like I did here, or make like a little washcloth or something. You don't need to do a ton of it. These stitches that I demonstrated here are exactly what you need to be able to do. So as soon as you feel like you know how to make these stitches, I think you could jump into the blanket pattern.